For George's folks, I gave this talk about 3 weeks ago at the dedication of Smith Hall as a national landmark site in chemistry. And there was a lot of people there, and others wanted to hear it again for some strange reason. So I'm going to try and say it more or less the same way I said it once before. So I'll start from the top. As I said at the ceremony, it's certainly a great honor for me to be asked to talk about my friend Piet Kolthoff. I knew him for 16 years that we overlapped while I was here and he was still alive. It's a great honor to be asked to give a talk like this, but it's a clear sign when you're starting to be asked to give historical talks that you're getting old. So that sort of lessens the honor just a bit. One of the things that most people want to know about Kolthoff right off the bat is, where does Piet come from? P-I-E-T. And the best I can make out from one of his former students who spoke Dutch, as was Piet's native language. In Dutch, it's a nickname, and it means something like little guy or little fella, because he really wasn't particularly tall. He was a short person, and he was very slightly built. But he may have been small in stature, but scientifically, he was a giant of the last century. Another thing a lot of people know about Kolthoff is his personal motto. I've seen it quoted many, many times: theory guides, experiment decides. But actually, Kolthoff inherited that motto from his PhD advisor, Nicholas Schurl. Kolthoff studied with Schurl at the University of Utrecht, and he got his PhD at that university. And that was actually Schurl's motto. Kolthoff's first real encounter with the area that he specialized in, namely analytical chemistry, was with this book by Wilhelm Ostwald, The Scientific Basis of Analytical Chemistry. That's how the German translates. Kolthoff's personal copy of the book is in the display case. Is it still there, George? Is it still down there? Yeah. Chuck is nodding, yes.
Everything's still there.
Okay, everything's still there. Okay, so I can say, I'll point out some additional things down there. Kolthoff bought this book when, roughly speaking, he was a sophomore. It says so inside some notes. He says he bought it at auction. He was always a frugal fellow. So one of the things I want to do today is summarize his life and career and tell you a little bit about him. For someone whose career spanned 8 decades, I mean, his active scientific career went over almost 80 years. He was born in the Netherlands, in a little town called Almelo. And he published his first paper when he was 21. That's relatively precocious. Certainly in that era it was. As I just said, he got his PhD from the University of Utrecht, and when he finished his PhD at age 24, he had already published 28 papers. And in fact, in his dissertation, he founded a very important field of analytical chemistry called iodometry. And that has to do with what you can measure by reacting things with iodine, I2. And still to this day, there's a host of inorganic and organic materials that are still best measured, most precisely, most accurately measured, using methods that Kolthoff developed in his PhD dissertation not quite a century ago. In the mid-20s, he took a tour of the United States And one of the schools he visited was the University of Minnesota. And actually, a year later, he came back to Minnesota. He was given a one-year trial appointment as a faculty member, sort of an untenured faculty member, even though at that point in time, he had 270 papers, more than most of us will ever publish, and had written 3 books. The guy who appointed him was Sam Lind, who was the founding dean of the Institute of Technology. He was the first dean of the old Institute of Technology, now the College of Science and Engineering. This must have been, I never knew this guy, he must have been really hard-nosed if he only gives a trial appointment for someone with 270 papers. Such a person would be coming in with tenure as a full professor in this era. So actually, Kolthoff's career was well launched before he got here, but he continued very rapidly to build a huge reputation. He was knighted by the Queen of the Netherlands at age 44. He continued to reap all kinds of awards and honors. One of the major awards in the U.S. is the Nichols Medal of the New York section of the ACS. Shortly thereafter, he got the American Chemical Society Award in Analytical Chemistry, and a few years after that, he became a member of the National Academy of Science, which is an extremely prestigious appointment in the United States. It's sort of the equivalent of an American knighthood, if you will. He retired in 1962, and retirement has to be in quotes. He stopped teaching, but he was still doing research for quite a long time. That was at age 68, and he had published almost 800 papers at the point he nominally retired. I got here in 1977 and almost immediately met Kolthoff and started to have lunch with him and chats after lunch. And I saw him working on this review paper of macrocyclic chemistry. Kolthoff actually lived on campus in Comstock Hall. He had an office in the Kaufman Union on the 5th floor. There was a little corner of that floor devoted to him. He had a favorite place to sit, which was an old wing chair. And I saw him working on this review article that had over 200 citations, and he had piles of reprints surrounding this chair. You couldn't hardly get to the chair. He said he read every single paper that was in the review. I believe it because I saw them. It was truly a major review of this part of this field of chemistry, and it preceded by just a couple of years the Nobel Prize to Jean-Marie Lane and Donald Cram for their trailblazing work in macrocyclic chemistry. Kolthoff really had a great view of what was important in chemistry. A couple of years, well, a year or so after that, he got another major award in analytical chemistry from the Pittsburgh Conference, and he continued to garner more awards even well after he was retired, because he was continuing to publish and do really first-rate research. This 1986 item is a little bit weird. It gives me an opportunity to tell you a bit of a story about Kolthoff. One of my neighbors was Mas Cave. He is the associate dean of this college. He's been associate dean for quite a long time. And it turns out that he had lunch one day at a table adjacent to Kolthoff, and Kolthoff's best friend on the faculty, Willem Leuten, who was a professor of physics and astronomy. Now, Leuten was essentially the same age as Kolthoff. They had both seen Halley's Comet twice. Okay? the period of Halley's Comet is, I believe, about 76, 77 years. They saw it when they were teenagers, and they saw it when they were pretty well along in life. And what Moss heard them talking about was how bright it was. And one said to the other, it was much brighter the last time. Now, these guys are coming up on 90, and I think they completely discounted the fact that their eyes were beginning to fail. And I know that Professor Luyten's eyes were bad because he had macular degeneration, and he lived across the street from me, and we used to bring him to work well, not work, he had retired, but he used to continue doing his research. So he had to quit driving because he couldn't see anymore. But still, they thought it was brighter the first time. Kolthoff died in '93. He died about a month and a half after his 99th birthday. That did not stop his career. There are papers that were coming out for a number of years after he died, predominantly due to the work of Moran Chantuni, who was his long-term postdoc. I think he worked with Kolthoff from the mid-50s until Kolthoff died. And also an emeritus professor from here, Doyle Britton. Doyle is an expert X-ray crystallographer and continued working on some projects that Kolthoff had initiated before he died. The most recent award that Kolthoff got was last year. He was inducted into the Minnesota Inventors Hall of Fame. Actually, if we consider the dedication of Smith Hall as a national landmark site in chemistry, in a sense, Kolthoff is still being recognized and being honored as a major chemical giant in the United States' history. You guys know that chemists love plots. So I'm going to summarize his career by showing you a plot of the total number of papers he produced as a function of time. There's not enough space to really list all of the things that he did scientifically, and I'm not even going to talk about all of these because it would just take too much time. I'm just going to talk about a few highlights. One of the very first projects that Kolthoff was involved in was he did the first potentiometric titration of phosphoric acid. Now, this was back about 1918 or so. This titration has been done, by my estimate, of over 100,000 undergraduates. This is a standard thing that we did for many decades in undergraduate chemical education. Another major field that Kolthoff developed besides potentiometric titrations is he did his first work in a field called polarography starting in the mid-1930s. Polarography was an electrochemical method of analysis developed by Kolthoff's friend Jaroslav Hajrovský, the great Czech chemist. Hajrovský got the Nobel Prize for the development of this technique. Actually, I was told by my advisor that Kolthoff was also nominated for this same field because he contributed so much to it. Kolthoff saw what polarography could do in terms of chemical analysis. Back in the 30s through the late 50s, polarographic methods were among the most sensitive methods of analysis for working at ultra-trace levels, ultra-low concentrations. And it was used for analysis of heavy metals and organic compounds and thousands of different compounds and materials. It has been superseded now by a number of other techniques, but Kolthoff was certainly one of, other than Hajrovský, you can't think of anybody who contributed more to that field than Kolthoff did. If you look at the plot, you can see that things slowed down for him. See the slope decrease in the World War II era. And this happened for two reasons. Number one, the supply of graduate students was interrupted by the needs of the armed forces, and so there were far fewer graduate students available to help do the research. But there was another factor, and that is Kolthoff and a number of other eminent American chemists were involved in what's called the rubber project. When the Japanese took over Southeast Asia, it completely disrupted the supply of natural rubber. You can't run a modern military without access to rubber. It's an essential ingredient in all sorts of things. So the U.S. government launched a project to develop a synthetic material to replace the natural rubber. And Kolthoff really was deeply involved in that project. It was known as the Chemical Manhattan Project. Shortly after the war, he was given several of the key patents for the manufacture of synthetic rubber. And so we could continue talking about lots of things, but I want to move on and get away from his specific chemistry. So sort of putting things together in terms of papers, he had 270 papers when he was hired here. He had 506 papers from the University of Minnesota before he retired. Subsequent to his retirement at age 68, he published another 239 papers. There have been 10 papers published after his death for a total of 1,025 scientific papers. That's a lot of papers. So I think it's only fitting that we come up with a new unit, and that's the Kolthoff, or 1,000 papers. Now to put this in real perspective, when an assistant professor comes up for tenure, they're lucky if they have 20 papers or so with them as the lead author. So to put it in perspective, the assistant professor at tenure might come in at 20 milli Kolthoffs. So what else did Kolthoff do besides research? And there's no denying that his research contributions were just huge. But he also contributed, in my opinion, almost equally, if not more so, in his books. This book, A Textbook of Quantitative Inorganic Analysis, was like the key textbook when I was an undergraduate. Ultimately, this book came out in 4 editions. It was published in 6 languages. I don't know how many copies were sold, but even one of the speakers at the symposium, Dick Zare at Stanford, remembered using this edition when he was an undergraduate at Harvard. Another magnificent series of books that Kolthoff was involved in is a so-called Treatise on Analytical Chemistry. This came out in 3 parts, 28 volumes, and there was a second edition of it after the first edition came out. Kolthoff had a lot of work in doing this. He was the editor. He wasn't the author. He was the editor of this series of books, actually the co-editor, along with his good friend Philip Elving at the University of Michigan. And for the first 5 volumes of this, Kolthoff's faculty colleague, Ernest Sandell, who actually got his PhD with Kolthoff, was also an editor of this series. And this is like the foundational series of books in analytical chemistry. Well, as I said, and by the way, those books and the textbook and the first 4 or 5 volumes of the treatise are downstairs in the lobby in the display case. So I mentioned a few minutes ago that frequently got called by Kolthoff to join him for lunch, and after lunch we chatted, and I learned a lot of somewhat more personal things about Kolthoff, and I'd like to share a few of those with you to get a little bit away from the science and more into what the guy was about. So these are a few of his favorite things. Now keep in mind, he was very proud of his Dutch heritage. So that is going to play a part in some of the weird things I'm going to tell you about. Well, he told me on a number of occasions that his favorite award was one of the last awards he ever got. And he got it at age 89, long after he retired. And that's the Award for Excellence in Education from the Division of Analytical Chemistry of the ACS. He was very proud of this. In this picture, he's giving a talk where he's accepting the award. I really like this picture a lot, although it's not my favorite picture. You can see that he's really into what he's doing. He's got that microphone, and he's not going to give it to anybody. And he's gonna get his time, allotted time at that mic. So I just gave you a big hint. What do you think? Bingo. Thank you. Did better than the last crowd. It's going to get tough now. Maybe only older people would know this. Dutch apple pie. This is tough. Somebody got it, though. Split pea and ham. I know that that's true because whenever I had lunch with him on a Saturday or a Sunday, the campus club made him up a tray of food, and it was always split pea and ham. I don't know how he could eat so much of this stuff. Okay. Favorite liquid refreshment? He's Dutch.
Vandervent. It's from the Netherlands. Oh.
Gin. He always had a bottle of gin in his office over in the campus club on the 5th floor. But if he was at a faculty function, he always asked for sherry. Okay, favorite game. He was a cutthroat bridge player. He was a masterful bridge player. He loved bridge. Actually, he was an avid sportsman as well. His favorite sports, as far as I could tell, were tennis in his younger days, horseback riding, swimming, and skiing. And actually, the horseback riding and skiing led to some of the problems he had in later life. He was really quite lame after he was mid-50s. He had a serious accident skiing and made it worse by falling off of a horse a few years later, and he had braces on his legs and used a cane and so on. And he needed help when he traveled. But he was a real avid tennis player in his younger days. Little known fact about Kolthoff: he was an intense softball fan. And here he is modeling a t-shirt from the Analytical Chemistry softball team, which was named "I am Kolthoff and you are not." He really looks happy with that. And the reason he's happy is we used to have pretty serious intramural between department labs, in the department, different labs. And Kolthoff had just heard that his team had beaten the hyper-competitive Gassman team twice in one season. This is absolutely off the wall. Hogan's Heroes, you've heard. I know this is true because when I would have afternoon conferences with him, they would always end before 4 o'clock. So I sort of hung around a little, and this is why they ended. It came on in reruns at 4 o'clock. Now, this is totally bizarre. Most of you are too young to have seen this program. But this was entirely stupid. You have to understand something about Kolthoff. I think it's interesting and confusing. Most of Kolthoff's family was killed by the Nazis when they invaded Holland. At the beginning stages of World War II. And somehow I think he's getting back at them by seeing these idiots being fooled by the guy in the middle every week. Kolthoff actually was a very involved person outside of science. He was very well connected in American politics. I have copies of letters between Kolthoff and Einstein, letters with Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, with Hubert Humphrey when he was mayor of Minneapolis. He was very well connected. He also was a very philanthropic guy. He contributed money to all kinds of causes. One of the major causes that he put a lot of effort into were the various universities in Israel, which got started even before World War II took place. And he, of course, received several honorary degrees from some of those universities. This is what his office door used to look like in the old Smith Hall before Smith was renovated in 1984. This is also down in the lobby in the display case. And this is a diagram of the third floor. That end of the building down there in 1984. And you can see Kolthoff's office, and immediately adjacent to his office was the office of his very long-term secretary, Krista Elgetha. Krista worked with Kolthoff for at least 40 years. In my opinion, he owes an awful lot of his success in his later years to Krista's ability to get things done. Krista was his interface with the rest of the world. She kept the wheels on the enterprise well greased and running. She was a superb organizer, I know, because she kept me organized, and that takes a lot of effort. But one of her jobs related to the fact that Kolthoff was pretty lame, and the men's room is all the way down there, is that Krista would scout out the women's room and give him an all-clear signal so that all he had to do was walk across the hall. Things were very different a long time ago. One of the things chemists always like to look into is their chemical genealogy. So there's Kolthoff. His chemical genealogy is very impressive. Somebody you've probably all heard of is Anton Lavoisier. So what is that, 7 generations back? Kolthoff is in Lavoisier's family tree. And there are a lot of other great chemists in there as well. And then coming forward in time, just as an example, Kolthoff had over 50 PhD students, but just as an example, one of his most outstanding students is James Lingane. Lingane, after completing his studies with Kolthoff, joined the faculty at Harvard, and one of Lingane's, or perhaps his most preeminent student, was Al Bard, who was part of this symposium honoring Kolthoff and the dedication of the chemistry building. Out of Kolthoff's tree coming forward, back in 1984, we did a study, and we found that there were over 1,000 PhD descendants of Kolthoff. That has got to have at least doubled in the past 30 years. I would be surprised if it went more than doubled. This is just one group of Kolthoff's graduate students in 1938. Jim Orleman spent his entire career at Berkeley. Jim Waters spent his career at Ohio State. Herb Lightnin was at the University of Illinois and also the editor of the journal Analytical Chemistry. And Jim Lingane, I mentioned already, went to Harvard in the late 30s and spent his whole career there. This is an outstanding group of people, and there were numerous groups like this that worked with Kolthoff. Kolthoff's impact on Minnesota has been huge, so great that when a few years ago we were changing from the Institute of Technology to the College of Science and Engineering, there was really no one more fitting or better to show the connection between the past and the future of science here in Minnesota than Kolthoff. This banner was on the side, the Washington Avenue side of the chemistry building of Kolthoff Hall. And if you look at this image here, it's the picture I showed you on the very first slide, made about 7 feet high and 4 feet wide. Kolthoff's impact on Minnesota has just been immense. I think the best source of information that's available about Kolthoff in one place is the memorial that his student Johann Kutzi wrote for the National Academy of Science. A couple of years after Kolthoff died, they have this tradition of writing a memorial. And the quote at the bottom is in that article. And it just shows what kind of a guy Kolthoff was. This picture was taken at the time of his 90th birthday. And you can see that smile and the gleam in his eyes, not just the eyeglasses, but his eyes were really riveting. He was a tremendously impressive person, even though he was not physically very big. There's really not a better way to sum up Kolthoff's career than borrowing these words from a writing of James Lingane that appeared in a special issue of Talanta, which is the International Journal of Analytical Chemistry, back in 1964. Analytical chemistry has never been served by a more original mind or a more prolific pen than Kolthoff's. That was certainly true in 1964, and I believe it's still true today. I want to say one more thing about Kolthoff. It's an aspect of him that doesn't really come through in the formal writings, and that is his interactions with his students. And I found in the files this letter from one of Kolthoff's students to him, dated 1961. It's from James Lingane at Harvard University. This was written because Kolthoff had announced his retirement and his students were writing him. Dear Pete, I want to add my congratulations to those of your other students and friends on this memorable occasion. Do you recall the day long ago in the spring of 1931 when Professor Geiger introduced me to you and you consented to employ me as your research assistant? That day marked the beginning of my scientific life. During the succeeding 8 years that I was privileged to spend in your laboratory, it didn't take 8 years to get a PhD. He joined Kolthoff's laboratory when he was a freshman. That marked the beginning of my scientific life. During the succeeding 8 years that I was privileged to spend in your laboratory, you became my scientific father. Those were wonderful years, and if they could be lived over again, I would not want to change a single day. The unknown student who sat on the opposite end of Mark Hopkins' log was not half so lucky as I. In simple truth, I owe my whole career to you because words are not coined for such a debt. I have tried to repay it by transmitting to my own students those things you have taught me, and I shall go on doing it so as I continue to learn from you in the years ahead. Sincerely, Jim. There's dozens of letters like this from his students in his files. This is, I think, what constitutes a person's real legacy, is the students. It's not the work. Finish with one story. Some years ago, we were interviewing a gentleman for a position in analytical chemistry here. He and I were standing in front of Kolthoff Hall. And he said to me, "What did Kolthoff do anyway?" We didn't hire him. But at that point, I understood that it's not the work, the science per se. It's the students that you work with that really are the legacy of a faculty member. So, with that, I will conclude. I know you're anxious to leave, but if there are a couple of questions, I'd be happy to try and respond. Bye-bye.
Where was Lingane after Minnesota?
Excuse me?
Where was Lingane's career again?
Lingane?
Yes.
Harvard. He went directly from here to Harvard. He stayed there until he died.
Can you tell the chicken noodle soup titration story?
I don't remember how old he was when he did this, but apparently his mother was making some chicken soup, and she used sodium carbonate instead of sodium chloride to season the soup. That would not be good chicken soup. He titrated the sodium carbonate with hydrochloric acid, neutralized it, and turned the sodium carbonate into sodium chloride. He was inventive. We wouldn't let you do that in lab now. At least drink the soup or eat the soup. No. It'd be perfectly okay, but we wouldn't let you do it anyway.
Were his labs on the same floor up here by his office, or was he elsewhere?
He had a couple of labs. There was a lab on this hallway, and then most of his lab space was in the back of Smith on the 4th floor. He had I know he had 417 in the adjacent space. It was great space. I was there one day when a metal trap fell off of a sink because it was saturated with mercury that had dissolved all the lead in the pipe, and it just let go.
We just replaced a trap full of mercury this week.
Hmm?
We just replaced a trap full of mercury on 3rd floor.
Really?
Yeah. They're around.
You didn't evacuate the building.
No. No. DHS didn't either. They just came and took care of it.
So
Okay.
are we saying that his lab was, or his office was in this corner back here?
Yeah,
Okay.
where the glass thing was,
where you're...
on the side of the door, you know, right beside the door.
Right, okay,
Yeah.
so, okay, yes, okay. And then where was your office at that time? If he was...
Well, he and I didn't he was not on the, he was emeritus by the time I got here. He was emeritus for like 15 years before I got here.
Okay.
So we didn't share.
So they didn't keep anything. Okay.
He was installed across the way.
He was already had his space in the campus club. I think he had that for a long time. He used to live in the campus club.